All right, so today is all about network threats and mitigation, and really this is a class we'll be covering in a lot more detail next semester, because who's taking security next semester? Okay, probably everyone in here. So we're going to go a lot more in depth, but today is all about from the network side. What do we need to be concerned with when it comes to networking? So some topics we'll be covering today: recognizing security threats. It's a very important thing to be able to recognize. Talk about vulnerabilities, and probably the most important thing we'll talk about today is mitigating the vulnerabilities. Because simply recognize you have vulnerabilities, that doesn't do you a whole lot of good, does it? If you don't know what to do about them. It's like, imagine if someone came up to me and said, Andrew, that's a really ridiculous button you're wearing. And I didn't know I could take it off. Now, I would probably counter that by saying, I don't care if you think it's a ridiculous button, I think it's pretty cool. Okay? Have your own opinion about it. But that's why you need to understand how to mitigate. Go over policies and procedures. That's a topic we'll be going into a lot more detail next semester. And then also talk briefly about anti-malware. So just kind of recap from, I think it was chapter 12. These are the three goals we're focusing on: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Okay? Because we want to make sure that what we're doing is only accessible by the right people. So it's not accessible by the wrong people. That's all about confidentiality. It's accessible at all. That's availability. And we have the correct information. That's going to be integrity. Does everyone understand the three main goals here? Okay. It's called the CIA triad. We're going to be going into that, talking about how these different threats may affect that. So, first one we're going to talk about is denial of service. So, obviously, denial of service is going to be where a system is not accessible. So, on the CIA triad, which one of those is this going to most affect? Going to affect confidentiality, integrity, or availability? Availability. That's exactly right. Okay, so some different types of things we could do, or some different types of things that could happen. Ping of death. So ping of death would be where you basically send out a very large ICMP packet, and the goal is to flood a buffer. Now, this is kind of ridiculous because do you think modern equipment would allow this to happen? Obviously not. So I don't know why it's really talked about that much, but hey, there it is. Speaking of that, I got some good news from the networking team. That's something else I was going to talk about. You guys remember how I said that I was going to try to get some different VLANs and subnets in there for the... So we got that approved. It's supposed to be rolling out this week. So I'm going to try to have different installs for the two different groups of pfSense. So if that all works out, which I hope it will, you'll just make sure to sign into the appropriate appropriate pfSense installation, and then you'll be able to save any changes and do whatever sort of crazy stuff you want. Does that sound cool? So again, I hope you like that. Unreachable gateway is an attack where basically what you're trying to do is to do a man-in-the-middle type deal. So you're going to take control of the secondary gateway. Then from there, you're just going to send a TCP open packet to the acting source host. Of course, once we've done that, it's going to send the ICMP redirect. It's going to reroute the routing table, change the routing table up. And then basically, you got a man in the middle. I don't really know why this is classified as denial of service, but whatever. Of course, more common in modern age, you're going to have distributed denial of service. So with denial of service, it's thought of as having a single attack point. Whereas distributed denial of service, you have many machines acting together to do a denial of service attack. Okay? So basically, it's just multiple parties and host. That's all we're talking about here, instead of just focusing on a one. And why do we not focus in on one? Well, it's easy. It's incredibly easy to block a single host, is it not? Okay, so if you're using something like any modern firewall, it's probably going to do it automatically if you have it configured in any competent fashion. Okay, so we got botnets. Okay, so how botnets work in general, they have some mechanism. They infect various hosts. Typically, you want to have at least 100,000. But, you know, more the merrier in a botnet. Obviously, I'm not suggesting you go out and create a botnet. But basically, those hosts are going to, at some point, receive commands from some central, they call it command and control server. And then basically, once they receive those, the important thing with a botnet is that it's going to have some sort of a network time clock, and based on that network time clock and the conditions set, it's going to flood whatever it tells it to. So, these aren't really anything to worry about so much in 2021 for several reasons. The main reason is you can mitigate this pretty easily, can you not? Okay. So the book talks about doing ridiculous stuff, like local mitigation. Let me see, I've got notes on what they said exactly. I remember reading it and being like, that's pretty ridiculous. I like to make fun of the book. Yeah, so it says do it locally, like a firewall. And I'm not saying not have a firewall, obviously, but, realistically, a better way to mitigate a botnet or any DDoS attack will be to use a content delivery network. Like, for example, the most common one probably you'll run into is Cloudflare, okay? So technology like that's going to have a lot better capacity to deal with something than any local infrastructure, unless you're a huge company like Amazon. Does that make sense? It's just ridiculous to do it locally. There's no reason to. Now, I'm not saying don't have firewalls. I'm not saying don't do basic mitigation, but let's face it, you got a couple million hosts trying to ping something. There's not a whole lot you can do about that, is there? Okay? So you're just going to keep that in mind. Of course, traffic spikes can be intentional or unintentional. It can be something that's caused organically. Let's say, for instance, someone in here really liked my button. Okay? So you guys could go tweet out how much you liked my button. And then maybe a lot of people would go on Twitter to see this button that everyone's tweeting about. Does that make sense? That's an example of an unintentional traffic spike. It's not really malicious, but could still cause problems. Again, address it with a CDN. Dead simple. Doesn't get any easier than this. Coordinated attack. It's basically just a botnet. We've talked about that. Friendly unintentional. Like I said, just thinking about traffic spike. Doesn't have to be something done on purpose. Physical attacks one I think is kind of interesting though. So physical attack, you're talking about the physical hardware. How can you do a denial of service attack with physical hardware? Well, it's up here. Steal it. Okay, you guys see this little guy running away with the money? Thought that was pretty humorous. Throw a few emojis into my slides. How about that? Yeah, so if you steal something, obviously, what is the main thing that's going to be affected on the CIA triad? So the main thing that will be affected, you're right, is going to be that we're not going to be able to access it at all. So availability, because it's not there. Now, beyond that, you could make an argument for confidentiality. Let's say you didn't encrypt stuff properly. Or, it's like they say, root access, or physical access is root access. Did they say that? Yeah, they say that. So with that in mind, sort of think about how we can best mitigate a lot of these problems. Okay? So, physical attack, how do you resolve it? How do you mitigate it, I mean? So if I had a phone sitting right here, okay, could anyone walk up and steal it? Yeah. So how do you mitigate it? Well, that's not going to keep someone from stealing it. You wouldn't leave it sitting around. Okay? So there's lots of different techniques and ways we can get around this. For example, the lab we have here. It doesn't have a ton of valuable equipment because most of it is at least 5 years old. And you think about a traditional value of equipment, so when you buy it new, value is going to be up here. When when it's 3 to 5 years old, value is going to be somewhere down here. And then eventually, if it's something that people liked, the value will kind of go back up. It's called the bathtub curve. Is everyone familiar with this? Okay. So most of the equipment in there is right around here, right at the bottom of its value. I still lock the door, okay? Because guess what? It would be really unfortunate and difficult to replace that if someone walked off with half the laptops, for example, in there. Okay, so obviously, physical attack, protect it by not letting it get stolen. Permanent DOS, this is sort of an interesting one as well. Okay, so permanent DOS, you upload a bad firmware and you basically brick a device. And the way to mitigate this, there's a couple different ways. Obviously, the most important one could be physical access, because for a lot of things, is it possible to install a firmware without physical access? For many things, it is not. It's a lot easier to install a bad firmware with physical access, even on the things you could technically do remotely. But of course, beyond that, have basic network protective measures in place. Make sure that you're not leaving management ports open, for instance. Make sure that you are using secure passwords. How the book would say to change the admin username. I think that one's kind of ridiculous. Okay, use a firewall. Make sure you're banning bad IPs. Just use common sense on that one. Okay, so Smurf attack. So we're going to send lots of pings to broadcast addresses, and the idea is that you continually do that. Of course, modern firmware. Obviously, for the past 15 years, this isn't going to be something that's going to happen, because what's going to happen if a device keeps on sending out just ping after ping after ping? You think the stuff's going to continually pass it on? Of course not. Okay, that's a ridiculous one as well. The send flood is kind of interesting. So basically, you send a send signal, get back the send ACK, and you don't send back an ACK. Okay, so like I said, this is one that modern firmware addresses pretty well, but not perfectly. So, for instance, let's say that someone were to do this. The idea is that you send enough synchronized signals to where you're not really, you're filling up the buffer, basically. Now, what do I know about modern buffers on modern networking devices? Do you think they're just 8 megabytes? Obviously not. So I would say this is one you're unlikely to run into, and should handle it reasonably well just with default settings, honestly. Any questions about DDoS? Does that make sense? Some other things to talk about, ARP cache poisoning. So of course, we know the ARP cache, address resolution protocol, caches all the different MAC addresses and IP addresses. And basically what you do here is you want to do a man-in-the-middle attack, okay? So you're just modifying the ARP cache. Mitigate that a lot of different ways, but most of this stuff's going to be mitigated by having decent networking settings. What I mean by that is closing inactive ports, making sure you're having a decent firewall and a reasonable configuration on it. Maybe using stuff like fail to ban. That's a great way to prevent someone from just flooding your network with, endless password attempts, that sort of stuff. Okay, spoofing. So several different types of spoofing. Got IP address spoofing. That's not really that easy to do. ARP spoofing, just talked about that with ARP cache poisoning. Email address spoofing is one that is pretty easy to do. Okay, because the older protocols, particularly POP, when you send a message, you can modify that packet before it's sent out, and you can change the from address. Okay? There's no verification on that. Now, IMAP addresses this, of course, but we're talking about, historically, this is possible. Okay, do modern email clients still accept POP? Yeah. So, with that in mind, thinking about this, how can we as an organization prevent this? Well, you can't really. I guess you could disable accepting POP messages, but it's not necessarily a popular thing to do. See that pun there? So, yeah, there's not really a great way. I think the main way is to just train people to not necessarily inherently trust any message they receive. Okay, then you got brute force attacks. Of course, brute force is where you're just continually trying passwords in an attempt to guess the correct password and access an account. So the book suggests that you do disabling of accounts on a certain number of failed attempts. What's the problem with this? So if we just disable an account because someone's trying to access it, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, let me rephrase the question. Are there downsides to this? What are they? So exactly, if we have an account that's being continually brute force or attempted to brute force, and we disable it, that means the actual person can't get into it either. So that's going to affect the availability. What's a better way to handle brute force attempts? On user accounts in particular. Okay. Use something like fail to ban. Okay. Pretty much anything you're using will support something like fail to ban. Not necessarily the exact implementation, but it's better to ban the person attempting to do it than to ban the legitimate user. Okay, does that make sense? Because imagine if someone didn't like you and they knew you had a deadline at 11:59 p.m. and they brute forced your account and you couldn't access it. Would you be very happy? Okay. Because if you had someone like me or someone like Paul, we don't accept late work. Okay, it doesn't matter what the reason is, we don't accept it. So that would be a pretty mean way to treat someone, would it not? I think it would. Okay. So, like I say, I don't really like the approach of disabling accounts after a failed attempt. I think it leads to a lot more headache than benefit, but I'm one person. What do you guys think? Who in here thinks that it's a good idea to disable after failed attempts? It has advantages. I'm not going to dispute that. Who thinks it's a bad idea? I probably biased the class a little bit there, but overall, I think that it really depends upon the circumstances more than anything. I think there are just some accounts that are going to be brute force 24/7. You just got to accept that and not use a dictionary password. Okay, session hijacking. This is where we have a session established, and basically some way or another we're going to hijack it. First way is session fixation, and basically what that does, gets the session ID, and it forces a disconnect, and then it rejoins after the authentication. Okay, so this is like you had an SSL connection, and you have a session ID for that SSL connection, and basically someone nefarious is able to get that session ID, and then they're able to send a disconnect signal, and then they're able to rejoin with that session ID after it's authenticated. A little bit difficult to pull off, but not impossible. Session sidejacking. This is a lot easier to pull off because all you're using is a packet tracer. Now, in 2021, is this easy to pull off? No. Okay, because for one thing, if you're running a packet tracer on a modern network, there's a lot of technologies that should detect that, and they should be able to shut that off pretty easily. Okay? But it is, of course, possible. And basically what that's doing is it's just taking the session code, and then once it gets the session code, it uses the session code. Okay, pretty straightforward. Or cookie, I mean. Okay, you got cross-site scripting attacks. Basically what that's going to use is malware to steal the session cookie. So these are the three main types. They're not as easy to pull off as they once were. Potentially, especially with like the introduction of, say, SSL. Okay, back then, it's a lot easier to pull stuff like this off. Okay, different types of malware. Again, we're going to cover this in a lot more detail next semester. But basically, you have your spyware. Spyware, of course, is there to take user data. Now, you may argue whether or not telemetry is spyware. And that's not really a discussion I'm going to get into too much. But the way I think about it personally, you can have a different opinion, of course. The way I think about this is, does the user consent to it? And if the answer is no, I consider it spyware. If the answer is yes, then I consider it telemetry. Does that make sense? So for instance, who in here has some sort of a personal assistant, be it a Google Home device, be it a Amazon Alexa, be it a HomePod, something like that? Who has one? Okay. You guys consented to it, obviously, right? So even though it's listening, you consented. It provides you benefit. So another characteristic of spyware is it doesn't often provide substantial benefit. Okay, does that make sense? All right, you got your virus. Of course, a virus is going to be something that's user installed and has malicious intent. Logic bomb, it's not really a specific type of malware. It's more of something malware does. Has some predefined characteristic in it. And once that characteristic is satisfied, then it will do something. So throughout history, there's been a lot of examples of viruses that had logic bomb components to where once a condition was satisfied, they did their action. Okay, but until then, it didn't do anything. It's very common in this next type, ransomware, to have a logic bomb. Basically, ransomware being malware that overwrites, or no, I wouldn't say overwrites, it encrypts files and then demands a ransom. Okay, so of course, a lot of times with that, to propagate it better, you would of course want it to have a logic bomb so that people wouldn't notice anything was wrong until the encryption began. Okay. Lastly, a worm is going to be a self-propagating piece of malware, typically spreads over a network connection using some vulnerability. For example, not too long ago, there was a vulnerability in the SMB protocol, which was, of course, Windows implementation of Samba, and it was patched and everything, including Windows XP. But of course, there was a worm that took advantage of that. I think it was called like WannaCry or something like that, and was spreading until Microsoft released an emergency patch going back as far as XP. Okay, so stuff to think about. Okay, humans though. Humans can cause lots of problems. For example, let's say you had a company with 100,000 employees. Do you think you're going to have someone there who hates your company? I'd say it's a guarantee with 100,000. Probably a guarantee with 1,000. So if they do something on purpose to harm your organization, this could be an example of a malicious insider threat. Okay, now you got 100,000 employees. Let's be honest. Do you think you're going to have someone who isn't very well versed in technology? I think that's a guarantee as well. Okay, so you got someone who's not very well versed in technology. They could do something unintentionally. It's an unintentional insider threat. Okay, so insider threat is going to be someone within your organization. External threat, of course, is someone outside of your organization. So that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about there. So vulnerabilities, of course, are going to be where we have some weakness. And the weakness does not have a preventative measure to prevent something from taking place. Now, I don't actually like this definition, okay, because you can have a preventative measure and you can still have a vulnerability, can you not? So for instance, let's say I have a network, and let's say I have a firewall. Even if I configure the firewall to drop every single packet, are there still vulnerabilities present? Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a bad definition, personally. I would consider it a little bit differently, but basically, you exploit the vulnerability, and that's how you actually would take something over. Okay, so some things to do. Unnecessary services. I don't think this is going to buy you a ton of security, to be honest. You have your own opinions. But the idea is that you don't want to have a lot of unnecessary services running, and this is particularly true on servers. On end-user devices, not such a big deal. But I don't think it buys you a ton of security, to be honest. Now, what it does do is it provides you with more resources for what you're actually wanting to do. So for instance, let's say you had 25% overhead you could cut out on a server platform. Would you do that? You should, because that's 25% additional performance you can get. And that's 25% less capacity you need. Servers have a very fixed capacity. When you really think about it and break it down, okay, they have some amount of performance. And that performance, it's a hardware limitation. So if you can save 25%, what else are you saving on? You're saving on electricity. Okay, that's a big consideration. You're saving on heating and cooling. Well, you're not heating a server room. You're saving on cooling. Okay, I'm pretty sure you could have a server room in like Alaska, and you probably wouldn't even need to have a heater in it. Because servers can output plenty of heat. Don't worry about that. Open ports. Obviously, if you have completely open ports, could be a potential avenue for attack. So you'd want to avoid that. Unpatched legacy systems. Let's face it. Is it possible for an organization to have no legacy systems whatsoever? Depends on the organization. Are there organizations that don't have the resources to replace some legacy systems? Yeah, absolutely. So you're going to run into that more than likely in your career. And when you do, it's important to recognize that it's not necessarily a ton you can do about it. You could suggest an upgrade, but let's be honest, there's a lot of industrial control systems that are millions of dollars. And do you think the firm wants to upgrade that every 10 years? I don't think so. Okay? Think about if you're in a manufacturing firm. Do you think they want to upgrade their machinery? No, it could be billions of dollars. Okay? So, how do you protect against that? Well, several different possibilities. You could air gap it. That's probably your best bet. Okay, of course, an air gap being it's not connected directly to a network. Another option would be to do something like put it on a separate VLAN and have very strict firewall policies. Of course, your firewall will be able to look for any sort of known vulnerabilities as well, to be able to detect if there's some attack that it knows. Lots of different things it could do. But I think your best bet is going to be to air gap when possible. Okay, does that make sense? No, are air gaps 100% foolproof? No, air gaps have been breached before. Think about the Stuxnet virus. Okay, you guys familiar with Stuxnet? Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, that was propagated via, I want to say it was flash drives in a parking lot. Okay, don't quote me on that, but I know that it was propagated, and the idea was to reach an air gap system. Okay, so you infect enough machines to reach that air gap system. Okay, it's not foolproof. Unencrypted channels, obviously you want to avoid unencrypted transmissions for obvious reasons, especially anything that's important. Now, let's say you're just a little old grandma keeping up with the grandkids, okay? Is that as big of a problem as, say, doing, investment banking? Obviously not. So, make sure that you're keeping in mind what the data is. But, in 2021, there's not really a big downside to encrypting. Okay, so you've got RF emanation, also stuff like sound emanation, and even things like timing how long a password attempt takes. Okay, now the good news is that something like timing how long a password takes to either accept or reject. Good news with that is that pretty much any modern system for the past 15 years is going to have a timer set in place to return whether or not it's accepted or not. So for instance, particularly if you're using a Linux install, and let's say that you put in the wrong password. Is it going to tell you immediately you put in the wrong password, or is it going to have a couple second delay? Okay. It's not slow, that's intentional. Because one of the attacks you could do is something looking at how long it takes. And based upon that, eventually converge on the password. Okay. But they're not going to let you do that, now are they? Okay. RF emanation, obviously several different ways you'd handle it. I think the main way is to shield things. I don't mean physically, well, I do actually mean physically shield, just not like with a shield that you're wielding or anything. What I'm talking about is, use RF shielding. Okay, it's not going to let the signals leave whatever space you're using. And beyond that, just don't use wireless stuff for anything sensitive. If you have stuff that's that sensitive, you're worried about RF emanation as a potential vector of threat. Why on earth are you doing it wirelessly? Use fiber. Okay, fiber is obviously not going to be subject to any of that sort of stuff. All right, any questions about vulnerabilities? Well, I've got a question for you all. How do you repair a damaged jack-o'-lantern? How do you repair a damaged jack-o'-lantern? Okay, use a pumpkin patch. All right. So some other things to think about. We got trusted users, got untrusted users. We talked about users already. Packet sniffing, like I say, want to have policies on your firewall and or router to not allow packet sniffing. Okay, if it detects it, block the user. Very simple. Buffer overflow. Again, any modern firmware on any networking device is going to be able to handle that. I wouldn't even bother worrying about it, to be honest with you, because let's say you do worry about it. It's not like you have the control to do anything about it, so, just let the firmware do its thing. DNS poisoning. Don't accept erroneous DNS edits, very simple. I'd go so far as for most organizations to say use a trusted DNS server. Have their own opinions about Google and Cloudflare. There's a whole topic to talk about their censorship and if that's a good or bad thing. I'm not here to discuss that. But I think it's fair to say that you would trust they're not going to do anything malicious to their own DNS. Okay, whereas if you use, say, your ISP's DNS, you trust your local ISP. You know, again, I'm not here to say what you should or shouldn't use, but I think you can do some basic math there and sort of figure things out. Okay, so ward driving. Ward driving, like we talked about before, drive around, or you don't have to drive around, you can walk around. Basically scanning for Wi-Fi networks, seeing what SSIDs are where, seeing what security they're using, and then once you have that, you can do ward chalking. Okay, so ward chalking is kind of an outdated term in a lot of ways because this kind of comes from the Great Depression, maybe before that, but I've always heard it comes from the Great Depression. And the idea is that there's different railroads you can get on, right? Okay, so some of them, you know, are nicer than others if they catch you taking a train ride without a train ticket. You guys know what I'm talking about, the Depression? Okay, so you would ward chalk that information, and that way other people could see it. It's like, you guys ever played Skyrim? Okay, you ever joined the Thieves Guild? Okay, so they make their little symbols, and I don't remember what they are, but I think one of them looks like something like this. Okay, is that right? Okay, that means, I don't remember what it means, but it means something. Okay, if you play the Thieves Guild and you get really involved in it, you know, you'll learn their different symbols that they place everywhere. And it tells you whether or not you can steal from them. Now, clearly I'm not condoning theft, okay? I'm talking about video games here. Video games you all have probably played before. Web cracking and WPA cracking, just exploiting vulnerabilities in those two algorithms. We'll talk about that in chapter 12. So of course, to mitigate that, obviously don't use those two, you know, especially WEP. Okay, WEP is a 40-bit key. Just not really good for anything, is it? Okay, deauthentication, that's where you'd send out deauthentication frames. That's a difficult one to do much about, but best you can do is block users, I guess, or block hosts, rather. WPS attacks, so you got Wi-Fi protected setup. This was common in like the, I would say, early 2010s, where you had a little button that you pressed on the consumer router, and you press the button on your device, and it would connect. Okay, well, there's a lot of vulnerabilities with that, so disable it. Rogue access points. Again, if you detect a rogue access point, try to locate it physically, remove it, unplug it. And then, you know, also, another way around them is, of course, to use certificates. Okay, so if you got a wireless certificate loaded onto your wireless network, and some device, you know, copies the SSID, nothing's going to connect to it because it doesn't match the certificate that it expects. Same thing with Evil Twin. Evil Twin is where you're trying to take a wireless network, you're just copying its SSID, and you're trying to have devices connect to it to have some sort of man in the middle going. Again, both of these, just avoid them with certificates. Try to locate the devices that are acting in that way, and yeah, go from there. I mean, could be someone just set up an access point in their office because they wanted to have faster Wi-Fi. They had bad signal. So to address that, remove the access point and try to, you know, see if it's possible to get them an access point. Maybe. If it's an actual problem, could just be they don't like your network. Lots of different reasons you may have it. Okay, so mitigation. Two major types of detection. Obviously, you got active detection and passive detection. So active detection, you're actively looking at logs, you're actively walking around. Passive detection, you're simply recording things. You know, you want to use them both, obviously. So we're not going to go too much into that in this class. But incident response policy is very important. Okay, so incident response policy, as the name would suggest, face a security incident, it's going to tell you exactly what to do. It's going to tell you who to contact, who to inform, when to contact, what information to record, how to record the information, where to record the information. It's all going to be covered. Okay. Basic forensic concepts. This is what you sort of outline inside your policy that you have. Okay, so the first thing you want to outline is, you know, how do you detect the incident? Okay, once you detect it, outline how to respond to it, how to report it, how to recover from it, how to make sure that the attack vector is closed. Okay, because it does do a whole lot of good if you kick someone off the network just for someone else to rejoin and do the same thing. Obviously, it doesn't. And then lastly, you review the incident and you document the incident. So, basic concepts there. Any questions about those? So in general, not all information is stored long term. So with that in mind, I want to think about how do we ensure that we're collecting information before it gets, wiped. So, think about if you're storing something, you think it's going to last longer on your CPU cache or your RAM? Okay. Obviously, it's going to last longer on your RAM. Okay. What about RAM versus hard drive? Well, hopefully, it's going to last longer on your hard drive. You'd have to have a pretty bad hard drive for it to not last longer, wouldn't you? So basically, memory contents, I would put before that cache contents, okay? Because if you have a cache, does it have a very large capacity? Almost never, okay? So it's going to be swapped in and out of there constantly. Try to get that out first. Now, probably will be gone by the time you even start typing the function, but maybe it won't. Memory contents, swap files. I wouldn't necessarily place one above the other there, to be honest with you. Depends on many factors, but if you have a paging file or a swap file, it could actually be smaller than your physical RAM. So it depends on the circumstances. Okay, network processes, stuff going across the network, system processes, file system information, and then finally raw disk blocks. It's not a whole lot that's less volatile than a permanent storage, now is there? I would hope not. Okay? So some different policies. You want to have security policies that outline everything that you do within your organization as it relates to security. This includes things like what devices do you allow? What devices do you disallow? What sort of patch schedule do you have? Do you do it centrally? What anti-malware application do you use? Is it managed centrally? Anything like that you can imagine. Your password policy, your physical security policy. Throw me some other things I'm forgetting. Anything I forgot there? There's probably several things, but they're common sense. Okay, so you audit those occasionally. You audit physical security. How do you do that? Well, see what you can get into. It's pretty straightforward. You do audit your IT security. Many ways to do that. We'll talk a lot more about that in our security class. Clean desk policy. I like this one for several reasons. Okay. Having said that, do I follow a clean desk policy? No, not quite. Clean desk policy says you don't leave anything out on your desk other than your computer, which obviously your computer will have various security measures on it, obviously. Hopefully it's encrypted. Hopefully it has a good password for any user accounts that may be present on it. Basic common sense stuff. But so for example, if you had confidential documents on your desk, you wouldn't leave them when you went home because, let's face it, are you the only person with a key to an office? Highly unlikely. Who may else have a key to an office? Well, how about your cleaning staff? How about your maintenance staff? How about your IT staff? Okay. You got something confidential. Let's say you are a company like Apple. Okay. Is Apple a very open company, or they're pretty secretive, especially with their R&D? I think it's fair to say they're pretty secretive. Okay, so they have a clean desk policy. They don't let people leave stuff out on their desk for other people to see. That's an important thing. Recording equipment and personal devices. Have a policy about these. Do you allow a personal device? Do you allow it to access your network? Do you allow it on campus at all? Recording devices. Do you allow them? Do you make them be locked up in a soundproof room, for instance? If you're a company like the NSA, do you think they have a policy in place that says no recording equipment? Yeah, they do. Now, recording equipment is not necessarily a bad thing, though. Okay, let's say you're a law office. Do you think you'd want your lawyers to have recording equipment? Almost definitely. Okay? Really, any one-on-one meeting in 2021 should probably be recorded. Okay? Just the reality. It's not necessarily something I'm agreeing with or disagreeing with. I'm just saying that's how things are. Licensing restrictions. Obviously, you'd want to have preventions from having things that don't have proper licensing. Because let's face it, let's say an employee does something stupid and they use pirated software. Is the employee responsible or is the company responsible? Okay, in almost every case, the company is going to be responsible. In fact, it hasn't really been since the late 2000s since that stuff was really going against an individual. You guys remember when they used to do like those multi-million-dollar lawsuits for someone who uploaded like 30 songs? Yeah, they don't do that anymore, do they? Because for one thing, it's ridiculous. For another thing, that's not where the money's made. Okay, because someone who's sharing 30 songs, do you think they have multi-millions? Better yet, do you think they even have the ability to earn multi-millions? I think it's unlikely. So in general, if you're suing someone, do you want to sue someone who can't pay you? It's not really worth your time. This is not legal advice or anything, but you'd want to consult a qualified legal attorney. But in general, you can maybe get an order to say, dock someone's pay, and take that. But it's not necessarily something that's guaranteed. So, in general, don't sue someone who doesn't have money. So all that's to say, you'd sue companies, right? Would you not? Okay. That's why copyright's important for companies. You want to have someone in place, or probably a whole department in place for a big enough company, that manages all the software. Not just for copyright reasons, but also for things like making sure that we have proper updates to run. Because you don't have software updated, what does that mean it could have? It could have vulnerabilities. International export controls, we'll talk about this a lot more in security, but many governments, the United States government included, prevent exporting certain goods or services. So I think the most common example you'll run into is the US government says you can't export, I think it's either 128-bit or 192-bit encryption. They definitely can't export anything greater than that, but I think the cutoff is either 128 or 192. And that obviously causes a lot of problems. Now, is that enforced? Consult a legal professional. Obviously, there is certainly software that is exported. And when I say export, I mean exported to non-allied nations. I should qualify that. So, like I said, just make sure you're following all regulations and laws, or make sure you're ready to fight regulations and laws. For example, who's on Epic's side versus Apple? Okay. Who's on Apple's side versus Epic? Who has no opinion at all? Okay. Well, look into that case and sort of think about which side you would fall on. I'm not going to say what I personally believe about that lawsuit, but it's an interesting thing to look at. It's not really that related to international export controls, but the point is that you can fight stuff. If you don't like something, you can fight it. Doesn't always make sense to fight it, though. It takes a lot of legal resources. Epic went after quite a few companies at once, and, well, like it or not, didn't end well for them. Okay? But there were some changes made. So, maybe it did end well for them, just not end well directly for them. Asset disposal is an important thing. As we said, equipment doesn't last forever. Its value doesn't hold indefinitely. And, new processing technologies release, and eventually you want to upgrade. So you're going to be faced with destroying, or, not necessarily destroying, but getting rid of existing information. Not information, I mean to say hardware. Okay? Can you guys tell I got like 3 hours of sleep last night? Okay. That's a personal problem of mine. That's why I'm all over the place today, though. Okay, so you got non-volatile storage. Remove it. Okay, you don't have to worry about stuff like RAM. Why not? Well, for one thing, it's volatile storage. As soon as it's powered off, nothing is going to be stored on it. Okay, so destroy any non-volatile storage. There's lots of different ways to do this. I'm kind of old school enough to think that the best way is to get a big shredder. And I'm talking like an industrial shredder. Most security departments at a somewhat large to large company are going to have at least one of these. Stick the hard drives in it. Is it dangerous? Well, don't stick your fingers in it, but, they have safety measures in place. So I would say physically crush any non-volatile storage that you can. Now, let's say you can't, okay? Well, destroy the whole device. You know, is that wasteful? Yeah. Does it make e-waste? Well, yeah. Is it avoidable if you want to have decent security in place? I would say it's not really that avoidable. You can have your own opinion, but I think that in modern times, even with solid-state storage, I think you could probably still recover files even after they've been overwritten. And I would say, don't rely on technologies like DBAN or similar utilities that continually overwrite stuff until it's reached whatever threshold you set. Now, other people have a different opinion. Okay, it's totally okay to think that you can get away with wiping something. I don't think you can, but maybe you can. Okay? That's not a risk I would take. Okay. Now, obviously, if you have a device that has non-removable storage, what does it also probably have? It probably has a battery. Okay. See this little guy right here, this explosion in the dead symbol? Okay, I tried to find the emoji. You guys know the one I'm talking about? It's like this cross eyes. So the cross. Tried to find that one, couldn't find it. So I settled with this skull and crossbones. Okay, if you don't remove the batteries and you destroy a device, what's going to happen? What could happen? Could there be a lithium-ion fire? Yeah. Is that easy to put out? Not at all. Okay. So that could be very bad. Now, also, lithium-ion. When it catches on fire, is that toxic? Yeah. What about all the other components? Are they toxic when they burn? Absolutely. So if you were to catch something on fire and you're unable to extinguish it, you should obviously leave as quickly as possible. Okay? Different anti-malware software. We, of course, have host-based, where it's installed locally on a machine. That's great for home use, but it's not necessarily great for enterprise use. Enterprise use is going to want to get notifications when a machine is infected. You do that with either cloud-based or server-based. And that's going to allow you to get those notifications and act accordingly. So maybe you want to wipe and reinstall a system every time it gets infected. Certainly one thing you could do. Maybe you want to research what the infection touched. Certainly something you should do as well. And of course, you also have a lot of protection built into a modern firewall. Okay, so it's going to be able to detect common patterns and act accordingly. All right, just kind of wrap things up. We talked about recognizing security threats, talked about some mitigation techniques for them, talked about various policies and procedures, and just a little bit on anti-malware. Something I'll note, anti-malware is something that really depends on the system you're using. So for example, one of the main reasons I'm not using Windows in the lab is because a lot of viruses and a lot of vulnerabilities and stuff on Windows that just don't exist on Linux. So I always kind of joke that the main antivirus application on Linux, ClamAV of course, it primarily looks for Windows viruses. Is that kind of funny? I think it's kind of funny. So, keep in mind, use whatever system, you have and act accordingly. Now, what's the best anti-malware protection? Okay? Should be sitting between your two shoulders above your neck, right? Okay, a good brain. Because, if you're stupid and you do stupid stuff, are you more or less likely to get a virus? Talking about a computer virus, by the way. I'm not trying to get any political opinions on any other types of viruses. But, if you access sites and you don't use stuff like ad block, whatever, and you click on malicious ads, obviously that can cause you lots of problems. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Use common sense. All right, any questions? All right, see you guys Wednesday. Have a great day.